Morning, everyone. Open your Bibles to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And we're going to be in about verse 9. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 9. And just while you're turning there, I'll give you just a couple of heads up and mentions on relationship to the flow of the class. I have high doubts that I will get through all of chapter 5 this morning. There's just too much. There's lots of things that Paul's kind of, as he wraps up this letter, he throws out various kinds of thoughts to consider, and so it's hard to pick and choose which ones you focus on. So we'll most likely not get completely done this morning, which means we'll finish up chapter 5 most likely on Wednesday. I did put the 2 Thessalonians material back on the back table, so feel free to grab that, but again, you're not going to need that most likely till next Sunday morning. Lord willing. We might dive into introductory thoughts about 2 Thessalonians on Wednesday night at the end of the study. But most likely you won't need those sheets until next Sunday morning is when we'll start 2 Thessalonians. And so that'll kind of be the map for the next couple of Bible classes together. And we'll kind of see how all that happens. Let's look now at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And we're kind of in a transitional moment, although there's a thought here that he shares in relationship to the same subject matter about their concern over what if I die before Jesus comes back, and is there any benefit to being a follower and a believer, a disciple of Jesus if you're not around when he returns. And Paul kind of dealt with that issue in chapter 4. He'll reiterate a thought related to that here in just a moment. But he's turned his attention somewhat away from that line of thinking, and has just been sharing some various thoughts with them here in this context. And he, in verse 9, says, "For God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ." At the end of the day, what does God want for you? He wants you to be saved. He wants salvation. And though there is consequence to not being obedient to God, there is an alternative, if that's a fair use of the term alternative. It's not a very good alternative related to heaven. But there is punishment. It's real. Hell is real. God's vengeance is real. The Bible's very clear about those kinds of things. But it is not God's intent. It is not His desire. It is not His purpose to condemn men. In fact, the truth of the matter is God really doesn't, in some senses, condemn men. Who condemns men? We do that ourselves, right? You have judged, the apostle said, you have judged yourselves unworthy of everlasting life. And so the real issue is not with God. What God desires is to let all of us obtain salvation. His desire is for all of us to come into relationship with Him and gain the benefit of salvation in whom? In Jesus Christ, he said in this particular passage. And so, always keep that as an important part of our relationship with God. God wants to save me. God wants me to see salvation. God does not want to see anyone lost. God doesn't want anyone to bring condemnation to themselves because of their own sinful choices and behaviors. And so we have been appointed, if the opposite is true, right? For God hath not appointed us to wrath, and so the opposite of that is He has appointed us to obtain salvation. And so it's important again for us to realize those things. He says in verse 10, he said, "Who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with what? With Him." That we would gain the benefit with Him, he said. And again, back to that narrative that you saw in chapter 4, whether you're alive when He returns, whether you're dead when He returns, whatever state or condition you happen to be in, the end result that He's looking for is that we live together with Him. Remember, He said that we will not hinder those who are dead, those who are asleep. They'll be gathered together with the saints who are alive, and they will be brought into the clouds with the Savior. And what's the last phrase? And so shall they ever be with the Lord. And so again, he's reminding them of the permanency of that and God's desire for them to have that benefit. And then here's the same thought we've seen, verse 11. Wherefore, do what? Comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also ye do. So comfort one another, edify one another, encourage one another, lead each other to recognize and appreciate the salvation that God is offering, and remind yourselves of that. I recognize an urgency to help men realize that there is consequence to sin. I realize there is an urgency about helping individuals realize that God does have a wrath as part of His character, that God Himself says, "Vengeance is mine, I shall repay, saith the Lord." So there is that side to God. But Paul here is trying to encourage them to realize that they need to be edifying and encouraging one another to remember that salvation is what I'm after. Salvation is what I'm seeking. Salvation is God's desire for me. That's ultimately His purpose and goal. Jesus said, "I came to what? To seek and to save that which was lost." He didn't come to condemn the lost. He came to seek and to save the lost. And so Paul's just trying to help them recognize that side of this conversation. And may I encourage all of us to focus on that side of the conversation. Acknowledge and admit that there's consequence to sin. Recognize that. But motivate one another by recognizing God wants to save us. And salvation's real. And it's comforting to know that. And it's comforting to know the great price that God paid by His only begotten Son to make that possible. And so don't ever forget really what God's purpose and what Jesus' purpose was all about in relationship to us. And use it to comfort one another. Is what He encouraged them to do.
Don't worry, Jesus will take care of it.
Yeah, and to recognize whatever's happening in this life is temporary. And there's a much greater purpose out there for us. And so whatever you're enduring or facing, and I'm sure they were dealing with a lot of challenges. And here's the interesting part, and it's a hard parallel sometimes, because sometimes we talk about the trials or the temptations or the challenges that you and I have to go through. But the truth is, at least for now, most of our trials and tribulations aren't directly related to the fact that I've chosen to be a follower of Jesus. In those early days, the bulk of their persecution and challenge was a direct result of the fact that they chose to be disciples of Jesus. And that decision was not met lightly by the pagan society they lived in, by the idolatrous people that they were surrounded by, and other religious entities that were pressuring anyone who became a believer in Jesus. Our struggles aren't always connected to because I chose to be a follower of Jesus. And so they are different in some respects. But yet we're challenged to do the same. To not be overwhelmed by the trouble and recognize the ultimate benefit.
Their persecution can lead to death.
Yeah, they're, and again, I'm not trying to diminish anybody's or trivialize anybody's trials or challenges in life. But they were being met with some very serious consequences solely because they chose to believe in Jesus. And I don't know that we experienced quite the same level that they experienced in relationship to that. Now here comes a challenge, verse 12. "And we beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you, and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you." This isn't our language. In other words, I don't know that ever other than in a biblical context have I ever beseeched anybody to do anything. Generally, I wouldn't say it that way, right? But we understand the point. There's an urgency about, I'm encouraging you, I'm beseeching you, I'm urging you to do what? What's He urging them to do?
To know His fellow Christians.
Okay. And very specifically, I think to know their elders, I think in some respects. To know them which labor among you and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you. He just got done talking about encouraging, edifying, comforting, motivating, to grab hold of salvation, to not relinquish it, to stay focused on it, all that conversation. And then he turns his attention in the next breath and says, who's leading that effort? The elders are, right? That's his commendation. And in order for that to be effective, they need to do what? To know. To know. I'm going to be cautious here because I don't want to put our elders or our members on the spot. But I want to think about this for a minute because I think it's a worthy thought. I'm going to ask a generic question I want you to think about. And I don't want you to respond. I just want you to think for a minute. How well do you know the elders? I mean, just take 30 seconds in your mind for a moment here and think about it. How well do you know them? And I don't mean, well, I know their name, right? Okay, got the easy part done. I know their name. Most likely, you know where they live. You could probably name their family members. So you have a general idea of who they are. But the thought here isn't just to have an understanding of who they are, but to know them. The more we know our elders, the better we are able to recognize the motivation and purpose of admonition and instruction and at times reproof or whatever it is that's coming along the path. I think that sometimes we might see some action or some act of leadership from our elders, and we're hasty sometimes to call it into question because we have predetermined what the motive behind that was. And we never stop to consider why I know this man. I know this person. And I know them well enough that this concept or motivation that I've created in my mind is inaccurate because I know them. So there's got to be a better understanding. And I think you understand what I'm trying to drive at here. We need to spend more time getting to not just, but to know them. Know how they think. Know what their goals and purposes for the congregation are. Know and understand the way they operate. Get to appreciate who they are as men, as people, so that you'll better appreciate why they lead in the fashion they do, why they make the decisions they make. And I realize you say that's a two-way street, but Paul wasn't talking about it from a two-way street perspective in this moment. He's talking about it from a one-way street perspective, and he's talking to us. He's beseeching the membership at Thessalonica, and by education us, to get to know our elders, because they're the ones admonishing. They're the ones that are leading based according to the Lord's instruction and organizational structure. They're the ones who have responsibility to watch out and be sure that we maintain our connection to salvation. And so encourage all of us to get to know them and more than just superficially. And to do our best to get to know who they are, which will help us understand how they operate in the way they think. And it'll benefit all of us. And then he says, verse 13, to do what? And to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. The work is hard enough without the membership being a burden to that process. That may not have been exactly Paul's words, but I think that's what he's trying to say. That for their work's sake, for the challenge of the work itself, they need to be esteemed highly. They need to be loved and appreciated for that work. And the end result of that is that there will be what? There will be peace among yourselves. The better you know your elders, the better you esteem them highly, the better you express love towards those elders, the better you allow for them to engage in their work of admonition and leadership within that congregation, the more peace that congregation will have. And I could share with you anecdotally and examples that I have witnessed in my own lifetime experiences where when there becomes strain and strife between members and elders, it is never good. And it's never peaceful. That's just the reality. It's never a peaceful situation when there is friction between leadership and members of a particular congregation. So Paul's challenging them. And again, early stages. And so my thought process is here, and we had a question, I think, and we talked about a while back in our study in relationship to Timothy's work when he went back to Thessalonica. Remember, again, Paul was in Thessalonica. He leaves. He ends up in Athens. He sends Timothy back. Timothy goes back to work with those in Thessalonica. Paul migrates on down to Corinth. And while at Corinth, Timothy rejoins him and conveys the knowledge of what's going on. And from this verse, I think we could fairly indicate that most likely Timothy has appointed elders there at Thessalonica. Somebody has. By the time that Paul has written this letter, he's writing back to them saying, here's how your relationship with your eldership should work. So if they didn't have elders in place, this doesn't make as much sense. And so I think we could fairly argue that they've been established under an eldership by this point in time. And his commendation to them in relationship to that. Thoughts or questions up to that moment?
Right.
Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about when you're, especially verse 12, when we were talking about knowing your eldership, as opposed to maybe what you may say it like in the work sense, well, I know that person, well, it's more of an acquaintance, you really don't, superficially. Oftentimes when we talk about appointing new elders, we go over to 1 Timothy and we read through the list of all the things that an elder is supposed to do, or qualities they're supposed to have. If you don't really know that person that well, how can you understand those qualities they have?
Yeah.
And not only, we usually talk about when you're just appointing elders, but I think it probably has to continue on even after they're in the eldership. Are they still maintained by those qualities?
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting parallel to this conversation in relationship to there needs to be a level of knowledge about what kind of character they have even prior to appointment. But that connection needs to continue in some senses to see that they're maintaining that same character. And that's a good point from this passage. So now an exhortation, verse 14. So now we exhort you, brethren. Warn them that are unruly. Comfort the feeble-minded. Support the weak. And do what? Toward all of them. Be patient with everybody. So, what I appreciate from this verse is that you don't handle every circumstance the same way. Every circumstance doesn't warrant the same approach, he says here in this text. Some are just flat out unruly. What do you think of when you think of something or someone who is just unruly?
Doesn't want to follow the rules.
They don't follow the rules. They are unruly. They are disconnected from any level of guidance, counsel, instruction, rules. They have become unruly. When somebody has reached the point of description of unruly, really the resort or admonition you have left is to warn. Okay? When somebody has reached the point of unruliness, where they are just disregarding any sense of constraint, they have disregarded any sense of guidance or instruction or laws from God's will, when that happens, the resort that's left for us is to warn that individual of their conduct and to challenge them in very firm ways to recognize that unruliness is not to their benefit or to anyone else's for that matter. And so a much more stern approach towards the unruly. Some are what, he says? Comfort the feeble-minded. Who are the feeble-minded? And don't point them out.
This version uses faint-hearted.
Faint-hearted, some translation use. And why I say that is because there's a subtle difference, at least, between the feeble-minded and the weak, because they get a different instruction. And so he says, comfort the feeble-minded, the faint-hearted, the lowly of heart, the ones who are spiritually, if you will, downtrodden in a particular moment in time. It's not necessarily, and it's not necessarily connected to weakness. It is more of a feebleness that is occurring within the spiritual mindset of an individual, who they don't need warned, they don't need told, straighten up your thinking, right? That's not what they need. What they need is comfort. They need to recognize that they can get through whatever it is that's challenging them spiritually, whatever's challenging their mindset about things. They need to be comforted and uplifted in that moment. And we need to distinguish between those things. The third one, and we'll talk about all of it here together in a moment. Did you have something, Jim? I saw your hand halfway.
Could faint-hearted also be considered a new convert in a way?
They could fit into that caption, but it's not necessarily. But obviously anyone can fit into that category where they need comforted in their challenge spiritually. And then he says, do what?
Support the weak.
Support the weak.
Over the week.
Well, I've thought about that a lot. And I challenge my own self in relationship to it. I don't know how good I am. Is that a fair statement to make? I don't know whether I'm as good as I need to be at understanding the differences between the unruly who needs warned, the spiritually faint-hearted who needs me to comfort them, and the one who's just in a position in their spiritual walk where they're weak in the moment. And they need my support to carry them through that weakness. And I think really that might be why he then finalizes the whole by saying, then be patient with all of them. Because I'm going to struggle at times knowing which one I'm dealing with. Am I really dealing with somebody who's weak in the sense that maybe they don't know yet? They're going to have a lot of weak brethren. They're young. That church is young. Okay, they haven't known about the Lord for very long. They haven't had much instruction yet. There are going to be some weaknesses that folks are going to have. Am I going to be able to see through that and kind of support people through those weaknesses till they're able to do what? To stand on their own and grow, right? And so some folks are going to need support, not have, if they're standing on one leg, to trip them and knock that leg out from under them. They need me to support them long enough so they can grow and get their balance and begin to understand things in better ways. So they grow. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. It almost called you old, and that wouldn't be fair. Congregations with a lot of older folks struggle with this. And here's why. We've been around the block 100 times. We've been around the block, and around the block, and around the block. And it confuses us. Notice I'll throw myself into that category. It confuses us when somebody doesn't understand something that I am convinced I have understood for 50 years. Why doesn't this guy get it? I have understood this forever. Everybody's not going to understand as quickly. Everybody's not going to understand as clearly. Everybody is not going to grasp things in the same manner that I have and will grasp certain things. Some people are going to need support while they grow to understand certain biblical principles. But the worst thing I can do is belittle or overly challenge someone who's trying to grow. And what they need from me is support. And sometimes I knock the last little wind that's beneath them. And I've got to be careful about that. it's okay to support somebody in their weakness, to give them time to understand things more clearly, to grasp biblical concepts in better ways, to get the maturity they need in relationship to God. Go ahead, Bob.
The Thessalonians, when Paul had left, had a misunderstanding of what he was trying to teach them. And they more or less felt that they would still be alive when Christ returned. So they quit working. They quit doing their own physical jobs, provided their living. They thought things was going to be coming to an end shortly. And they gave up working. They become idle. And that's, I think, a lot of the reasons for this letter that he's writing to them, to try to get them to, he called them feeble-minded or timid, weak-minded in the Lord. And they didn't understand. And this is why he's writing this letter, to get them to start working again.
And without again insulting or trying to be insulting, but some people are smarter than other people, and they grasp concepts. You know, Sam at 18 understands math 18 times better than I do, right? Because he was able to grasp those things much more quickly than I ever did. In regards to anything beyond real numbers. When I call real numbers, if it has a letter in the equation, that's not real. That's all fake. That's my mindset about that stuff, right? But some people, and my point is, some people are smarter at certain things than others, and so we've got to be patient, comforting in the feeble-mindedness sometimes where folks are challenged to grasp, and where they're weak and struggling. They need to be supported, and we need to be patient. We want everybody to think like me, act like me, know what I know right now. You should know it right now. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way.
These people are coming out of an adulterous generation with, and it would have been hard for them to understand a lot of stuff.
They are completely flipping their thinking about things. From a multiplicity of gods to the God. Purity. Paul's throwing a ton of ideas and thoughts at them that they need to grasp. And these are the things that are going to be necessary
That's one
to help
reason
them all.
Timothy back too, to help them.
Yeah.
Also, Brian, he's talked about the elders in verses 12 and 13. I think it's important, and I think you've made this point, but I think it's important that we realize that in verse 14, he's talking to all of us. Those aren't jobs just for the elders. Those are things that all of us need to.
Yeah, because he hasn't, even though he talks about elders, but the beseeching was to the members. So the you hasn't changed. The you he's talking to hasn't changed through that narrative. And so you're right. When we get to this point, that's an instruction for everybody, not an instruction solely. The elders are going to lead, but it's not an instruction solely for the elders, because the you he's discussing here, it hasn't changed. The people he's talking to. So let's learn some patience. And by the way, let me just say it, just because the text says it. That includes that guy. Patience even for that guy. And what I mean by that is even the unruly deserves my patience. So says the Apostle Paul. And I know it's hard and they need warned. Don't misunderstand. Don't overstate the case. That doesn't mean you don't warn because I'm patient with them. Doesn't mean I don't warn them, because he also gave that instruction. Warn them about their behaviors and the choices they're making and the destruction that comes because of it. But patience is offered to everybody, from the unruly to the feeble-minded to the weak. Be patient and see whether or not a level of patience might benefit in the growth process beyond these things. And ultimately, verse 15, see that what? And that no one renders evil for evil to anybody, unto any man. But ever follow that which is good, both among yourselves and all. Everybody. Is that what society would tell us?
No.
No. Society says the exact opposite.
Get even.
That's right. We live in a get-even world. And unfortunately, we live in a time period where the get-even world is a lot simpler than it used to be because of the media access that all of us have. We all have public outlets now. We have abilities to reach audiences that was never possible. Really, in some ways, 10 years ago, 15 years ago even, not all that long ago, when some of the social media aspects were just starting to become very popular. But as that has grown, the ability to seek my own vengeance, the ability to seek evil for evil has exponentially grown in great ways, unfortunately. Because people have gone about using what could be a positive tool to bludgeon one another. And you don't have to live in a cave, or rather, if you do live in a cave, maybe you've avoided some of it, but you know, we see it. And let me tell you, the smaller the community, the more difficult this is, I'm convinced. They had a guy down at the school, anyway, I'll be careful. I don't want to qualify it, but anyway, he had kind of a dual role. He was a jazz musician, so he played, and so he had that side of why he was there. But he also presents a bullying message, and so he did that while he was there as well. And one of the things that I talked to this fellow briefly after his presentation was he kept saying things like, well, this is a small school, and so you probably don't have these problems. And I went to him and I said, with all due respect, I said, because it's a small school, the problem's actually worse. And I said, it's worse because all of these kids, they know each other's Facebook accounts. They know each other's cell phone numbers. They interact 24/7. You get into a big school, you may have some issues while you're in the building, but when you go home, guess what? You get to leave it. You can, in many ways, leave all those troubles behind you, and in some senses, go live in an entirely different world. You go to a small school, by the way, that's everybody, for the most part, within that's New Martinsville. They're all small schools right here. Okay, well, I'm in big ones. From the two counties, from County North, I think John Marshall, I suppose, would be the largest. But small schools have great difficulties, big time difficulties, with people avenging themselves and rendering evil for evil. My point is that it needs to be understood, and we have to be careful. And sometimes the smaller the community, the greater the challenge to try to rein some of that in and be cautious about it. And be careful what we say and how we say it and who we say it to. Because if I render evil for evil, even if I felt like sometimes we render evil for that which wasn't even evil, which is a problem within itself. But seeking vengeance and rendering evil, even if I felt like I was treated in a bad way, isn't going to help a situation. And I have that obligation. First and foremost, Paul says, to my brethren. And secondarily, I have that obligation to everybody. To not render evil for evil and be cautious about that.
And Brian, you have the King James version up there on the screen, I believe. And it uses the word, but ever follow that which is good. I don't believe the King James in that particular aspect makes the language strong enough according to the Greek. Instead of ever follow, he's trying to tell them to seek it, to pursue it, to go after it, that which is good. Don't just kind of follow along, but actively search for it, seek it, pursue it.
Right, and there's a heavier meaning than just to casually attempt this. There's stronger verbiage here that maybe doesn't translate well into English, but there's stronger verbiage here to compel us to do these things.
NIV uses not to pay back wrong for wrong.
Yeah.
They took a text from the Bible about an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a like for a like. And completely took it out of its context, what was meant, judgment for each judgment. There's supposed to be what was wrong, the judgment is supposed to be equal to that. And it's like even movies have done it, where the patriarch of a family, of one of his children was killed, he had to kill somebody who killed him, It's completely taken out of context.
Yeah, we have very much given ourselves over to the concept that if somebody does me wrong, my sole purpose from this point forward is to make sure I do them wrong in return. And again, that's a failure on our part when we kind of get caught up in that kind of thing.
That ruins your influence of others too.
Right. It doesn't help. Number one, generally when you render evil for evil, if somebody's dishing out evil, there's no proverb, and I think it goes something like this: if you wrestle with a pig, you both get muddy, and the pig enjoys it, right? So you wrestle with somebody, you get in an argument with somebody who's bent on doing evil. All you're going to do is muddy yourself up, and they enjoyed it, and you're now tainted by it as well. So don't go down that path. Don't get this tick for tack. You did me wrong, so I'm going to do you wrong. It's just going to add misery, and you may actually make that person happy because their intent was to make misery. So valuable lessons there.
A lot of times it's not just get even, it's get ahead.
Yeah, and we'll sully righteousness in order to accomplish those things sometimes.
We need to use, I'm going to use the word sensitivity. Look at each person through a sensitive eye as to the condition that they're in, and then process that in order to accomplish all those things. We have to be sensitive toward that individual.
Sure.
And that sensitivity is going to vary from individual to individual to individual.
Well, and let's not forget it's said within a context. And the context the context at hand was, how do I handle the unruly? How do I handle the feeble-minded? How do I handle the weak? I need to be patient with all of them and see that I don't render evil for evil, even among those who, out of their weakness, they rendered evil. Out of their failures, they rendered. And so we again have to be cautious about how we think about those things and appreciate the challenges that we create for ourselves and others when we don't do that. And it robs us of these things. Okay? You start rendering evil for evil, there's not going to be much what? There's not going to be much rejoicing. Okay? And rejoice in what way? Evermore. You and I need to appreciate the joy and its offspring, the things that it produces. Rejoicing is supposed to be something that's to permeate all aspects of my life. And I rob myself of joy when I'm consumed with evil and rendering evil in return for folks. I rob myself of the very benefits that God desires for me. Joy is to permeate. And I have to be cautious that I don't let things rob me of that. Let's come back. Lord willing, Wednesday night we'll come back and let's look at these last brief phrases that Paul uses here at the end of this. And like I said, we may introduce the second epistle. We may get into 2 Thessalonians. So just look at those. Answer your questions for chapter 5. Look at 2 Thessalonians. We won't get far into it much later.